All right, so we have people joining us, which is wonderful. I'm just going to give it a minute to let people kind of come in. They are joining quickly. So I'm just going to share my screen so we are seeing, at least I think I am. Am I? Oh, yep, there it is. Okay, everyone, we're going to get started so that we can get a lot of content in this hour webinar. I want to welcome everyone here to the monthly webinar series for Special Education Legal Fund, SELF. I am Laura Sullivan, and I am the staff attorney for SELF Legal Aid. I am really thrilled to be here tonight with this subject and this expert panel to talk about the cliff, transition, and beyond. And oftentimes, in education, we focus on that K to 12 piece when looking at special education needs. And there are many, many students who require support and services after that. So we're going to talk about all things transition. First, there are some housekeeping items I need to address. I would like to thank our webinar corporate sponsor, Chapel Haven Schleifer Center, as we could not have these programs for you all without the support of our corporate sponsors. One of our esteemed panelists is from Chapel Haven, so they are doubly supporting us tonight. So thank you. And I want to hopefully go the next. Yep, there we go. Next slide. These are all of our corporate sponsors, and we just want to thank them as well. I would not be an attorney if I didn't have some form of disclaimer. So this webinar is for informational purposes only. It is not legal advice and does not create any kind of attorney-client relationship. Families who are seeking legal guidance should consult a licensed special education attorney in Connecticut or New York. And participation in this panel does not constitute an endorsement by Special Education Legal Fund of any speaker, professional, school, or organization presented. For those of you not familiar with SELF, our mission is to provide resources and knowledge to families in need with children in the special education system. SELF seeks to empower parents and guardians to fully advocate for their students and to level the playing field for families in need with children in special education. In September 2025, SELF began providing direct legal services to qualifying families in the area of special education for students with IEPs in Connecticut through SELF Legal Aid, and I am the staff attorney for the SELF Legal Aid. SELF also provides grant programs for legal support and advocacy through our attorney and advocacy grant program. And for more information on any of those, you can go to our website or you can scan this QR code that will bring you right to where you would want to be. Just a commercial for our December 3rd webinar coming up in our series. It is about school avoidance and refusal, another really great topic, especially at this time of year when those things start to kind of settle in. I will be moderating, and we've got another wonderful panel, including attorney Meredith Braxton, advocate Mary Waghorn, neuropsychologist Dr. Erin McCauley, and head of school for Fusion Fairfield, Amanda Sylvester. So now to our panelists. Their full bios are here. I'm just going to give a brief introduction for each of our panelists. First, we have Christy Chandler, Senior Vice President of Admissions and Communications at Chapel Haven. Christy has been in special education for over 20 years as a special educator, mentor, director of admissions, and now in her current role. Speaking with Christy, it is clear how passionate she is about the adults and transition services she works with, and hearing her talk about the empowerment she sees is really inspiring. This is Christy's fifth appearance, I believe, as a SELF webinar participant. So thank you very much, Christy. Next, we have John Savita, Director of Transitioning Programming at Winston Preparatory School. John also has over 20 years experience in education and currently focuses on developing and leading programs for Winston Prep in New York City and San Francisco, recognizing that while many students go on to post-secondary education, some need continued skill development to be successful, and he works to provide that. And this is John's third panelist appearance. Ashley Fiorita is a college and career counselor at the Pinnacle School, experienced in working with a neurodivergent population from middle school through post-secondary settings. And I can really appreciate that Ashley focuses on individualized planning and inclusive pathways for students. This is Ashley's first self-webinar, I believe. So welcome, Ashley, and thank you for being a panelist. Next, we
Thank
have
you.
Melissa. Melissa Gagne is a special education attorney with Laviano and Gagne, as well as an adjunct professor at Quinnipiac Law School, where my daughter attends, and I hope she takes Melissa's class one of these days. Um, Melissa came to law later in her career, and after being a teacher, an assistant principal, and a principal, she also went through the special education system as a parent with her son Ryan. I don't know how Melissa has time for all of the things that she does, but I appreciate her taking the time to be with us here tonight. And this marks Melissa's fourth self webinar. And finally, rounding out our panel
Hey,
is Advocate
Laura,
Julie. Yes.
do you want to advance the slides? I think the other folks are
Oh, I'm
not getting
sorry.
their
There's
little bio
John.
shout
There's
outs.
Ashley. Sorry, I can't do two things at once. And there's Melissa, and here's Julie. Thank you very much, Christy. Julie Swanson is, like many of us, Julie began her journey as a mother when her son Alex was diagnosed with autism. Julie was and is a staunch advocate for Alex and many other children and has developed incredible expertise. You may also know her as the Life Skills Lady, as she has amazing content out in the virtual world about enhancing the quality of life and independence for children to adults with autism. Julie ties Christy, with this being her fifth appearance on a self webinar. So I can stop sharing my screen, go back to our panelists, and we're gonna get into it. So we're gonna jump right off the cliff, right? So when we talk about the cliff, John, I'm gonna start with you. What are we talking about when we're talking about the cliff in transition planning?
Yeah, so really what we're talking about is a often or always a sharp and abrupt drop in services, both for legal entitlements, academic supports, social emotional supports. So we're in that starts at, typically anywhere from age 18 to 22, meaning once a student leaves K through 12 programming.
Thank you. And what kind of misconceptions do families have about the transition process? I'm gonna jump to Christy on this one.
Sadly, I think there's a lot of families who don't know that this is supposed to be a part of the process. So that's a misconception. And I think also not understanding like free and appropriate versus like, I just love this program because it's amazing and it's the Cadillac. And even like looking at least restrictive environment versus, private special education settings can sometimes be a confusing piece. But I think overall, just starting too late, families are trying to start this process sometimes if their school district hasn't been moving them along in that, when they're 18, and that's really pretty late. So.
Yeah, and I know we're going to get to that content in a little while about when you should start, but that's really great information, Christy. Thank you. Ashley, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I think a lot of misconception comes when parents think, oh, my student is really academically inclined. They're doing the work. They're able to do the work when they can, but without executive functioning support, support with self-advocacy and independent living skills, I think they're all equally critical. And, that really doesn't determine levels of independence until we see that.
Thank you. And kind of, rounding out the setting the stage for the cliff. Not it, we're going to get into a little bit when transition planning starts, but what kind of early actions matter most, especially in Connecticut when it comes to the law? I'm going to turn this one over to Melissa.
So in Connecticut, at transition planning has to start at age 14. So, at age 14, you have to start, you know, the having the discussion at the PPT meetings. The school districts have to start connecting parents with outside agencies. They have to start thinking about I always like with my clients to, at that point, to start thinking about doing a futures mapping planning, so that, which is a session that's conducted and parents are allowed to invite anybody who has knowledge of the child, and you sort of start, it's like backwards design. It's like, what are your hopes and dreams for your child post, after post secondary, and then we work backwards and say, what do we need to put in place from the time we're 14 until that happens, to make sure that we can get that child there. So those conversations really have to start at the middle school level, but age 14 legally in Connecticut. The IDEA says the IDEA. So if someone's here is not in Connecticut, says that the IEP after the child turns 16 has to include the transition goals.
But if somebody's in another state, their state may also have some other parameters to start earlier, like Connecticut. So
Right.
check your state too.
Check it
For our audience, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and I will try to scan the questions as we're talking. And if we have time during or at the end, we'll certainly get to as many questions as we can.
And Laura, if I could just add really quickly, the
Of
IDEA
course.
also says that teams can start transition even earlier. As long as the team agrees, you could start transition earlier than even Connecticut says here at 14.
Thank you, Julie. That's a really important part. What would it look like for a student that might want to start it earlier? Julie, I'm going to bounce it back to you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that we're always looking, when you have to think ahead to the fact that this whole process is to get us ready for life after high school, for independent living, if appropriate, post-secondary education, and employment. And so you always want to be building the skills that are going to get you ready for that life. And of course, it depends on the child, but perhaps some kids who might be more severely impacted by their disability, you might want to start working on life skills, as an example, at a younger age than 14, as just one example.
Sure.
Laura, can I add one point as well? And I don't not to take up too
Absolutely.
much time. The other piece of that, and I think to Christy's point about families often coming in the 11th hour, that can be incredibly complicated and challenging for the individual, right? To all of a sudden feel like they got the rug swept out from underneath them, that, now all of a sudden my plan has changed and something else is being presented to me. So yes, absolutely 100% earlier the better. And that also, I think, for the families to understand, that doesn't mean just because you start transition planning and you're identifying maybe a longer runway for your child, things could change, and maybe they might not need those services moving forward, and that can shift, right? So, but it serves a really valuable purpose to start much earlier for a whole host of reasons.
Thank you very much, John. Can you also kind of expound on what an effective transition program would look like when it's working?
That would be a very long and comprehensive list.
The quick version.
But yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we talked about many of it already, but certainly it has to be, student centered. I think having the parental voice as a part of that is incredibly important. Not completely leaving it up to the child, because if we're looking at a transition plan for that child, that most likely means that they're not yet ready to start making those types of decisions, right? So having that parental input is incredibly important. We talked a little bit or mentioned employability. It's my personal soapbox. Employability is paramount. That really is what's going to lead to the greatest level of sustainability and independence in somebody's adult life. It's where we spend the most of our time. And academic, having a solid plan in relationship to continued and higher education, if that seems applicable for any individual. Again, building in employability skills. I think it was Ashley or Christy might have mentioned independent living skills are incredibly important. The practicality around learning, so learning for life, right? So continuing those academic skill development, but not necessarily in a traditional fashion, and thinking about how it applies to the practicality of everyday living. So financial literacy being a part of that. Social emotional is incredibly paramount to the, again, sustainability moving into adulthood. We're talking about, the complexities that we all face as adults. And it's even more significant for our kids in relationship to the things that they're going to have to deal with, the amount of problem solving that's going to have to be engaged in that. So goal setting, I think soft skills are underrated often, but actually very highly rated in the world of employment, just as much as hard skills, if not more so, and should be. Again, again, this is a very long list and there's a
Sure.
whole lot of detail, but I think that probably gives you a quick snapshot.
That does. Thank you. That's really
Yeah.
helpful. You talked about the families a little bit. So jumping back to our attorney and advocate, where do you see the biggest gaps between what is required and what families might think is happening during this process?
You want me to start, Melissa, on that
Sure.
one?
Thanks,
Okay.
Julie.
Well, first of all, I think somebody mentioned it before, and one big gap is like not even knowing that this process exists and that they're supposed to be made aware of it, right? It's more than a gap, right? It's a lack of knowledge. I also think another big gap is assessments. Understanding as a parent that the assessments drive what the need is. It identifies the strengths, but it also identifies the weaknesses, which of course create the present levels of your functional performance and your academic achievement, and identify what the goals will be. And without those assessments, which can be formalized, they can be through observation, they can be through parent input. There's not just one way to assess a child. But without those assessments, like parents often think those are just being done, and oftentimes they're not even being done, right?
Mhm.
The school team is just coming up with what they think, which and but there could be that there's a more formalized approach to that as well. And that is that we could be considering the needs of our children who have a higher level of need, that they are to consider if they're able to live independently. And in today's world, that's not just for our kids who have intellectual disabilities or autism, but also includes a lot of our kids who have mental health issues, right? Because we have to have all those skills in order to live independently. And then I guess the last one would be the existence of post-school outcome goal statements. Our post-school outcome goal statements are those vision statements that drive the whole process. Where do we see our child for employment? Where do we see our student for post-school outcome, for post-secondary education? And where do we see our student for independent living? And lots of parents in my experience don't even know that those post-school outcome goal statements exist and that they drive the whole process. So those would be my top three or four, however many I mentioned.
Thank you, Julie. So, Melissa, Julie touched on evaluation, which in pretty much any special education case is an important aspect of it. So, when when school districts, when a parent feels the school district isn't necessarily looking at all of the factors that, John mentioned in terms of the transition, what can a parent do in terms of evaluative information?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it happens a lot, right? So the district will say, okay, now we're discussing transition. These are the transition assessments that we do here versus these are the transition assessments that make sense for your child individually. And so unfortunately, that happens a lot. And so I think it's if you are getting data from evaluations that, well, first of all, people have to remember that, transition, FAPE is still applicable, for transition, right? Free and appropriate public education. So the school district is still legally obligated to provide that through transition. And so if you are not in agreement with an evaluation, listen, you still have the right to request an independent educational evaluation. You have the right to do that. If you do, the district will either has to grant it or they have to file for due process to defend their evaluation. But I think, the other thing to think about is I just want to get back to the gaps because it ties into this. One of
Sure.
the gaps that I see consistently is that even if a student may be college bound eventually, I find that school districts don't evaluate and consider employment skills as part of that child transition program. And so it's one thing for, to think about a child, going to college, but ultimately they have to be employed. And they drop that. I see school districts drop that a lot. And it's like one or the other. And I don't think so. I think every student really almost every student, I should say, who is being evaluated for transition the level of employability and employment skills should be considered and should be looked at. And I think in terms of not really agreeing with an evaluation, you have your dispute resolution process. You would want to, note your disagreement. You'd want to make any request on the record. If the district is saying no to an evaluation that you're requesting, I would ask them, to not just why, but what data do they have to suggest that your child doesn't need to be looked at in that way? I mean, there's a lot of avenues to go, but I think um, the most common one is, if they do a battery of evaluations and you're not in agreement, you request an IEE.
Melissa, there was a follow-up question. What age does FAPE end?
So FAPE ends when when your child reaches whatever state that you're living in. So right now in Connecticut, a child may be eligible for services until the end of the school district until the end of the school year. I've had 4 PPTs today, so my brain's a little twisted. At the end of the school year that they turn 22 in Connecticut, or when they accept a standard high school diploma, whichever comes first. So whatever that age is in your state, or when your child accepts a standard high school diploma, whichever of those come first, that's when the district is no longer obligated to provide FAPE.
Thank you. Christy, I'm going to turn over to you because I think a lot of the population you deal with are relating to some life skills and adult readiness and things like that. So in looking at the assessments and the things that we've talked about, how are life skills assessed and built into programming prior to exiting a student?
Well, I think whenever Melissa was talking, this was actually one of the areas I was going to say is a lot of times, particularly if a student is academically pretty strong, they're overlooking the life skills. And so, like, even if they're college bound, like, they still got to, go to the cafeteria and buy their meals and, do some of these basic things that, frankly, are often what becomes one of the first things to go whenever the student is in the college environment and they're overwhelmed because now they have all of these demands that they're trying to balance at the same time and something's going to give. So we really encourage families to, number one, make sure that, like, if there's a need, it's on the IEP related to the independent living skills, and then to work together between home and school to be implementing things that can start moving them forward, instead of mom and dad waking you up every day, you get yourself up maybe one morning a week, right? It doesn't even have to be every day. I think that some of the school programs are able to start incorporating things like basic meal prep, navigating the community safely. And so reinforcing whatever they're learning at school and making sure that parents are reinforcing that at home and then trying to do, the same in the other direction, I think is really important.
And I
Thank
think,
you.
Christy, just to expand on that a little bit in regards to what you're talking about, and it's a high level of communication, right? So, when we're thinking about our families, this is really their last chance to have that level of communication with their child's provider, right? The program that they're working with. Once they go to college, once they leave the nest, as we say, that stops, right? So having that consistency of messaging, as you're describing, right? What can be done at home? What can be, incorporated into that individual's life, not only while they're in a program, but also outside of that program in the community as well.
Yeah, and also paraprofessional support. If somebody is going to be, whether they're headed to college or a post-secondary program or whatever, if they've been supported by a para, consistently throughout all their classes, maybe helping with some of those executive functioning skills, what's going to happen when they're in a setting where that para is not there anymore? And so how do you start working together as the student is ready, obviously, to start gradually fading those and incrementally increasing their ability to take on responsibilities and be a little bit more self-directed, because I think that's often a big surprise maybe for the families and the students whenever they leave the school setting is there's so many incidental supports that are just baked into that K-12 environment, and that is not the case whenever you move over to the adult realm. So making sure that there's conversations about how to structure that so we're setting them up for success.
Well, thank you both for that. That was really great answers. Ashley, in your role as counseling, could you help families kind of understand there's this range of these services, right? I think when we say
Yeah.
transition services, it's not clear that there's a bunch of different options for it. So can you kind of talk a little bit to what those might be?
Yeah, there's a ton of different post-secondary pathways. There's the traditional college pathway with or without disability support. I certainly heavily encourage supplemental support from programs like UConn's Beyond Access or Curry's Pal program when they are ready to be independent and on a college campus. There's a community college or certificate program, and lots of those are popping up with more support now. So, for example, community college in Connecticut, they changed it to Connecticut State Community College Norwalk. All of them participate in the TRIO program so that they offer, executive functioning support, academic support for students that either have a documented disability or are first generation college student. So I think that that's really helpful, especially with the PACT program in Connecticut, where you can attend a community college for free as long as you're taking 2 or more classes. So it can be completely free for families. Vocational training and apprenticeships, of course. There are colleges specific for students with learning differences, like Landmark College, bridge program like ours, the Pinnacle Postgrad program that builds independence, and really, it's especially important, in my opinion, when building confidence. I always tell my students, it's not that I think you can't do college. I think that you need a step before that. You need a step to build the strategies and the skills that are going to make it so you're not questioning, am I able to do this? Or college just isn't for me. That's the worst fear I have, is that they'll start without that support thinking I don't need it. I'd rather them start it and then, of course, wean off of it if necessary. And then lastly, adult services, as we've mentioned before, they need to be ongoing. They need to be collaborative. And a lot of the times the parents really need to be in the driver's seat in terms of advocating for that, because it's not always readily available information.
Do you have that you can pull up kind of an example of a successful transition and what factors might have gone into it being a successful transition?
Certainly, I can think of several success stories where my students are graduating college, they're moving on to get a job, or they're just sticking into college, right? Like maybe they haven't found a job right away, they're completing college. They're always with these college supports programs that have like these supplementary supports per semester. Usually it's like $3,000 a semester, and you get executive functioning support, academic support. They syllabus map, which is such a useful tool to help break down assignments into smaller chunks and prioritize your due dates. And it's really just a skill that, in my opinion, needs to be taught so early. But especially at these colleges where they can teach it in real time, I think those are the biggest success stories that I have, is these colleges get it.
Laura,
Yeah.
can I give an example of a success story for
Absolutely. I think those are really important for people to understand how it looks in real life, right?
I think I want to address the the profound population who aren't going to find themselves on a college campus, and how, it's really important to think about transition. So my son, Ryan, he was profoundly autistic. He's intellectually disabled. So he's not going on a college campus, but we spent, and again, that it goes back also to that beginning of the transition planning, really connecting with, for kids like Ryan, outside agencies that are going to be involved in Ryan's life when he ages out of school services, and making sure that those people were involved along the way. But, and so for Ryan, we did as much functional training as we could during his transition time. And as part of that, I'm just going to give you an example, and I know this is difficult because it's hard to get employers, on board, especially with, the profound population, but we were able to get him into practicing his skills with Meals on Wheels. And the program he was in was connected to the agency that he was going to age out into. And so he was able to do Meals on Wheels. And then when he aged out, he was able to continue to participate in the Meals on Wheels program, because, the DDS person had been going to his PPT meetings since, from the time he was like 15 years old. So it was, so I think you have to think of transition for wherever you have to meet your child, wherever your child is going to be. If your child's not going to be on a college campus, there are still steps that you should be taking to appropriately prepare. And if you get the right people involved and around the table early enough, The cliff, it's there and it's real, but there are some opportunities to mitigate some of those the deficit of services after they age out.
That's great. I think hearing from, different angles is, John, do you have any success stories
Yeah,
that you'd want to share as well?
sure. We have a lot. I could share a very personal one. I'm also a parent. One of my sons, I have twin boys that are 22, and one of my sons has learning challenges, a neurodiverse young man. He went to Winston Prep for high school, did a year at Winston Transitions, and he's now going to be graduating college in December. A half a year early, only a half a year behind his twin brother, which was somewhat important to him. But more importantly, he was able to develop the essential skills, right? And I think talking about transition planning, my wife and I had that conversation with him so much earlier on, right? So that it was a much softer landing when he didn't go directly to college like his peers or his brother. And just creating something different for him. And I would say probably one of the most impactful things, and I think the program itself was impactful, but I would say probably the employability and the internship piece was really impactful for him because it put him out into the community. It was a year-long internship. It wasn't geared to be his lifelong trajectory in regards to a career, but he had fine motor skill issues, a lot of executive functioning challenges, math learning disability, and just a lack of confidence, right? So having this opportunity to work in a coffee shop bakery on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and deal with a really fast-paced environment and develop that awareness, that self-awareness, and those advocacy skills was tremendous for him. He landed a job post that for 2 summers at that same coffee shop. He opened and closed, and now I'm very, very proud to say that he has a job waiting for him. When he leaves, he's working with the adult autistic population. He's a human service major. The college he went to Dean College, incredibly supportive. Again, I think to Ashley's point, took well advantage of the support services that were in place, but he was ready for it. And I think that's the really important piece, right? Is that it wasn't just, let's launch him out and hope for the best. It was putting in that time and he did the work, right? But identifying what he needed to be successful. And again, that's a personal story, but that also encapsulates a lot of other individual stories, as unique and individual as it is. But it also, again, it gives an overall view of what can be possible.
Yeah,
And it's a very proud story for myself and my family. So
thank you for sharing it, both you and Melissa. Thank you
sure.
very much for sharing personal stories. Melissa, a question popped up relating to what you were saying. How would someone from DDS be at a PPT, as case managers aren't assigned before 18, or is that not the case?
I don't know that that's a hard and fast rule. I know that for my son, DDS was involved very early on. We had DDS involved when he was very, very young, all the way through. So I would say, and again, your school district can help you connect with DDS, and they can help you with the paperwork to try to get connected. But I would say, yeah, I think by the time he was 15, there was somebody from DDS at his PBT meetings.
And can you just define DDS for those who don't know what it is?
All right, it's the Department of Developmental Services. And so, they're still heavily involved in Ryan's life. So
Thank you.
That's I know this is jumping ahead just a little bit, Laura, but I just
Sure.
want to tag on to what Melissa's saying. Like, that's such an important note about getting involved with DDS early, because I hear two things from families. Either they had no idea about adult services at all. And like, I'm talking to them when they're 24 and I say, did you ever, apply for DDS? What is that? I don't even know what that is. But then also, it's a process. It takes time. And so if you can start working with DDS whenever you're younger, you're in your teens, there's so much supports that they can potentially be giving them, like in the home or through like working with a community mentor and things like that, that can help prepare them for the transition that we've been talking about, while also having them connected and in the system so it can go, smoothly from K-12 to adult services, which I think is what the cliff, that's the bad one that we're talking about tonight.
And Christy, can you just expound on what qualifies a student to have access to DDS services?
Yes. So in Connecticut, and Melissa and Julie can probably answer this even better than I can, but for Department of Developmental Services, you have to have an IQ that is less than 70, which I understand there maybe is some chatter about that possibly changing, but that's the case right now. And you have to have like evaluations that show that that disability occurred before the age of 18. You can easily go to their website and kind of see what some of the other criteria are. But the really important thing to know is that if you're an individual with autism and you've got a 72 IQ or, a 95 IQ, there's also the Department of Social Services that has an autism waiver. And it does have a pretty significant wait list, which is another reason to get on it as soon as possible. And there's diagnostic criteria again on the website showing you basically that you have to have a documented autism diagnosis. I think it's before the age of 22, I think, for that one.
And
just to clarify, someone, a panelist from New York,
Yep, I was going
wanted
to do
to make
that.
it clear, and I was going to say to OPWDD, the Office for
Yes.
People with Developmental Disabilities, would be the equivalent to DDS in Connecticut.
Yeah.
And just to add to what Christy was saying, not only do you have to have that lower IQ in Connecticut, but you also have to show that you have low adaptive skills.
Yes.
And there is a movement afoot, as in other states, where there is no IQ cutoff. It's just proving that the student has low adaptive skills. And that, I believe, is what's, there's some movement afoot regarding that in Connecticut.
That's great. Thank you, Julie.
Sure.
So there's a lot of questions popping up about DDS, and maybe that would be a great topic for another webinar, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So I will
lots of time there.
put that on my list of things to address at a later date. So some of the questions specific to DDS we're not likely going to get to tonight, but please know that we hear the interest and will certainly work to address it. We've heard a little bit about, what a transition program should or could look like, and some of the barriers that get into people's way. And so I guess I'm back to, Melissa and Julie, documenting the needs and pushing for measurable, individualized goals and objectives. What does that look like? Julie, why don't you start?
Well, documenting the needs, I'm going to go back to assessing. How do we start to document needs? We have to assess the needs. And like I said, that can be done with the team input, parent input, observations, formalized assessments. There are all sorts of ways to gather that information. But I think it's really important that parents, when they have their IEP team meetings, that they share their concerns. They ask for their concerns to be on the record. I always like to say to parents, hey, consider also audio taping your meetings, because it is one more way to have a documentation of actually what happened at that meeting. But those assessments should then drive what the measurable goals are. And as far as making sure that they're measurable, there's the age-old, what is it called in an acronym? SMART. The SMART, measurable, attainable,
yep.
Reliable, time sensitive, something like that. Look it up online. It lays it all out for you. But really for parents to be aware of what makes a good IEP goal, right? And I always like to say the simplest way is when you read a goal, can you tell what observable skill your child is going to have at the end of that year? What observable skill will they have? And so as far as the post-secondary goals, again, before, handing it over to Melissa, I can't stress enough being aware of what the post-school outcome goal statements are. There needs to be one for employment. There needs to be one for post-secondary education and, if appropriate, independent living. And those statements drive the IEP goals. That's the umbrella under which everything falls, right? And I think, Melissa mentioned before person-centered planning, whether that's a MAPS or a futures planning. That's an excellent way for everyone to come together and really be in alignment about what do you see for your child's future? What does your child also see for their future? Go ahead, Melissa.
And too often, everything that Julie just said, those conversations don't happen until the child is in 12th grade.
Right.
it's much too late. That's much too late to be having those conversations. I mean, we get calls in our office in April or May saying, oh, they just told us at a PPT that there were no transition services beyond, from 2 months from now. So that's why it's so critical to everything Julie's saying, to look at that, look at all of the goals, look at all the objectives, and make sure that, they're all measurable, but make sure it's happening well before that 12th grade year.
And Melissa, there's a question that popped up that's kind of relevant to this discussion. We talked a little bit about evaluations to kind of get transition services. And in our K to 12, we know if you are receiving special education related services, you're getting evaluated at least every 3 years. Is it the same in that transition period? Should there be an evaluation during or before the end of your transition services in order to access any of those post-transition services that might be available?
Well, it's still that these districts are still bound by the triennial. So wherever that triennial falls during those transitional years, the district is still bound by that. The question about access to, adult services, DDS is going to, or whatever the version, they're going to want a recent IQ, because basically right now they're going to want a recent assessment to evaluate adaptive and adaptive skills. So you're going to want to get that within a year or so before they age out. But in terms of the other assessments, the district is still bound by that 3-year timeline. So they still have to, conduct a triennial, even if the child is, 20 years old in a transition program.
Now, I have heard in, just practicing, and since I have this panel of experts, I'm going to ask the question. I have heard when you get an IQ that's 70 or below, because IQs can change by a few points depending on the testing, the circumstances, the child, the growth, that once you have that, I've heard you do not want to test again for IQ, because then if the IQ jumps above that, you may be risking the services. But what I heard you say is that they are going to potentially require a recent IQ. So I just want to hear what you have to say on that point.
Yeah, so it's below 70 is the criteria. So if you're riding that line, they're right, but DDS will ask you for an IQ that's been done within, I believe it's a year.
But doesn't for DDS, Melissa, it have to be before the age of 18 that IQ
sure, but I'm
has
talking,
to be captured?
For sure, it has to be before the age of 18, but Laura's asking about when they're older and right
that
about
18 to 22 period.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
22 and about to age, age out of school services.
And not that I'd want anyone to go through this process, but if it does change and DDS does deem that the student is not eligible for DDS, you can appeal that process. You can appeal it. Not that you'd want that to happen.
So we'll put that in our DDS webinar.
Yes.
And Laura, just to say too, from like the admissions perspective of a post-secondary program, like we definitely like to see evaluations within the last 3 years, because I mean, even 3 years is a really big gap, but when you're able to compare that to a current IEP, that kind of helps bridge that gap a little bit. But yeah, there's tremendous growth that these young folks are going through during that time. So it is helpful to have something more recent to capture that.
Thank you very much.
That is why some states don't have the IQ cutoff, right? Because it's a number.
Yeah.
And it really doesn't reflect what our kids can do.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a lot of other variables. There's a lot of other
many
measures.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
So, John, I'm going to jump back to you with a question. So, in the process, you've got to determine whether a student is college bound versus a higher support pathway. And when you're looking at kids, what indicators or criteria are you using to kind of guide that decision?
I think we touched upon many of them already in relationship to readiness, right? I mean, looking at the overall executive functioning abilities of an individual. Are they going to be able to manage, if we're thinking about college, right? And that is a fairly typical trajectory that families and students look at, as a next pathway, post high school, or a post secondary program like the ones that we're talking about. Advocacy, I think, is tremendously important. If you're not able to access the resources that are available to you, whether it's in a very highly supported college or especially in an employment scenario, or even in personal relationships, right? If you're not able to advocate for yourself and you're not self-aware, which obviously goes very much hand in hand with advocacy, it's going to be very challenging, and those supports won't be valuable. Self-regulation and self-reflection, right? If you're not, so many of our students, and I think, when we're thinking about the comorbidities that exist for someone with a learning difference, or someone that had, an individual with autism, anxiety and other stressors play a huge role in their level of functioning and their ability to self-regulate, right? So having that intact, right? So, seeing, engaging that, um, again, independent living, we've talked a lot about, and I think to Christy's point, that gets overlooked a lot, especially when you have students that excel, like Christy was saying earlier, in academics potentially, or have a higher level of academics. Those independent living skills are incredibly important, right? But just because you have a level of intelligence in one area doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to take care of yourself. So I think, the way that I've always looked at this, and again, I said this earlier, um, the student doesn't always know themselves yet. Sometimes they do, right? Sometimes they have that real gut feeling that they're not ready. Sometimes they don't, and they want what they want, right? Which is totally understandable. But I think if the family and everybody involved is seeing and saying similar things of concern, then that's a really strong indicator as well, right? If all these elements are not intact, then that's a pretty good indicator, or a very strong indicator that more time is needed. And again, I think to Melissa's point earlier, it is individualized, and everybody's needs and meeting the student where they are is incredibly important in this whole process.
And so, Christy, in a population whose goals might be centered more toward the daily living or supported employment, does any of that look any different?
No, in fact, the only thing I was thinking of that John didn't say that I was thinking of is like social communication skills, like and being able to
Absolutely.
navigate that. And I think that's really hard in college whenever, again, you don't have some of the natural supports built in from parents and from teachers who can kind of do the nudge nudge and, hey, why don't you come over here and do this, and can often lead to folks isolating in their dorm room because they just don't know what to do. So I think that is also a real benefit to considering, like John was saying before, or Ashley might have said this, like the stepping stone prior to college is getting in a place where you can get comfortable with yourself and you can get comfortable with being others like that, like you are, where you're not feeling like you have to mask or kind of like put up a front. I think that's a really profound thing that I see for folks at Chapel Haven, as they finally feel like they're in a place where they belong and have friends that are true meaningful friends. So I don't think I answered your question there, Laura. I'm sorry. I went off.
No, that's fine. Everything you said was very relevant to our discussion anyway. Melissa, one thing that comes up frequently, and you kind of touched on it earlier, when you get the calls in, May from a family, if a family doesn't think that their child is ready to graduate and the school is planning on them attending graduation and receiving a diploma, what can you do?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it depends where you are. So if that's how, if you're in April or May, that's a bad position to be in, but it happens and we do get those calls. And so what you can do is you can file for a due process hearing and try to invoke stay put. And invoke your child's stay put rights. So, which means that so stay put is a protection under the IDEA that during the pendency of a dispute, the child remains in the last agreed upon IEP placement. And so, I mean, that would be, that's like the first thing to do is try to get a hearing officer to order stay put while you try to work it out. And if just like we expect the school district to bring data to the table to support their decisions, parents need to bring data to the table to back up why they believe, the opposite. And so it may end up, in a due process hearing, but that would be the first thing I would do.
Thank you. And Julie, in your role as advocate, what should families be doing to document and protect their rights under the IDEA for transition eligibility?
For trans for okay, so let's, when I think of transition, I think of two things, right? I think of the transition that's happening while you're in high school and you're 14. And then there's the transition that you're possibly going to move on to after your traditional senior year. So ask me the question one more time so I make sure I understand it.
So I guess it's just when you're in the meetings, what are you trying to document or demonstrate um, in order to protect the student's right to possibly
Okay,
receiving these transition services?
I'm going to go back to assessments
Yeah.
because it's all about the need. And you can prove and document the need through assessment, which again, I'm going to remind everybody doesn't have to happen through formal assessments. It can be the parents sharing, you know what? My child is still not able to have emotional control when something doesn't go their way. How's that going to work for them when they go and get a job? Well, they're going to be fired, perhaps, right? If you have a fit at your job. So it's always documenting along the way the need, and to think of those three pillars of employment, post-secondary education, and independent living, and all the way along saying these are concerns. And you know, if you're not going to go on beyond your traditional if you're going to get exited from special education at the end of your senior year, you need to make sure that those skills are in place before they exit. And if the team doesn't think that they can be in place before they exit, well, then that's one very good legal argument to support the fact that this child is going to require these services beyond the traditional senior year, but the senior year. I don't know
Thank
if
you.
that's sort of a quick explanation, but
Yeah, I mean, there's so much.
there's so
Ashley,
much
there's
to
a
it.
there's a question in the chat that I wanted to direct to you, and it's what does social emotional skill development look like in transition, and if you can include some specific kind of real world examples.
Sure. I think a lot of it, especially with our population, has to do with modeling and role playing. So really role playing scenarios that might occur like in social relationships or that are already occurring in your personal life that you want to talk through. We certainly like, especially when we're focusing on college, we certainly have students practice what it's going to be like to live with a roommate or just to have these conversations like with a professor, depending on like what we need to address. And I certainly think, I'm sorry, I want to make sure I'm getting at to the heart of what you're saying.
Sure. It was what does social emotional skill development look like in transition? And please be specific with real world examples.
Yeah. I also think that it's important that there's mental health counseling. And I know that John touched upon that before. We're lucky enough at our school to be a therapeutic school where we really put a heavy emphasis on that. And as we mentioned in the beginning, many schools just don't have that. They don't have that as a program within their transition services, or even, the most they have on college supports on a college campus is like the counselors that you can come see, if they're available, but not really a dedicated time to talk with them. And I think our population, as John mentioned, so many comorbidities, there's anxiety, there's depression. And I think that when you don't have that critical piece, that's when the EF isn't working or the employment doesn't really work. So I think that's critical.
Thank you.
And the integration of that is incredibly important. So it's not just an isolated or a kind of like a pull-out situation where it's
Exactly.
integrated. I think is incredibly important um,
Thank you,
because it
Scott.
impacts all areas of that person's life.
John, I'm gonna stick with you for a moment. So we talked a little bit about DDS, and there's obviously a lot of interest in that. Excuse me. Are there other systems available after exit from this transition period? And what does the school to adult handoff kind of look like?
Yeah, that's where things get complicated, right? And
That's the real
you
cliff,
know
right?
that's a real cliff, and sometimes for some families an abyss. And the longer that goes on, the more complicated it gets, right? Well into adulthood, 20s, 30s, 40s, where things were not remediated and addressed in a really significant way, or that was left and the individual went to college and then comes out of college with a degree and they don't know what to do with that. And that happens often, unfortunately. And then they either wind up underemployed or not employed at all. Access VR, I know came up in one of the chat questions, is a service. It's a state-run organization. It's a bureaucratic system. It takes a lot to navigate it, very much like the DDS or OPWDD. I think one of the complicated pieces of Access VR, and they can offer some wonderful resources in regards to, aligning individuals with employment, and employment services to develop those skills. But again, if the core skills aren't intact, then those services aren't valuable, right? If you don't show up to one meeting, they'll drop your case and you have to sign back up again to reissue your case and get a case manager and go through that whole process again. There are some other programs out there. There was a wonderful organization that we've worked with over the years called Ken's Crew. I'll give them a little plug. Are you familiar with Ken's Crew, Christy? We had a few students who went through that program, and what they do is they employ or they set individuals up in Home Depot specifically. They have a partnership with Home Depot, and they're able to develop employment skills leading to full-time employment at Home Depot. Actually, just interviewed one of our graduates from 2015 who had worked at Home Depot for seven years, I believe, and is now moved to Massachusetts and working in another environment. But again, gained valuable experience. Job Path is another program in New York. Again, I'm going to speak probably more New York centric, but there's a huge waiting list. So there are programs out there, but I think it all speaks to the importance of being in front of the eight ball as much as possible, to use that analogy, right? So that you're not, losing ground in relationship to accessing any of these types of supports that exist.
Christy, I see you added Level Up. I just want to let you talk about that too.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I thought I was posting it to everybody, but I just sent it to the other hosts. So in Connecticut, the Access VR is called, goes by BRS and DOORS, Bureau of Rehabilitation Services. And like John said, it can be a slow and cumbersome process, but it can work. But I've heard really positive things from families where students have done summer jobs through the Level Up piece of this offering. So I would encourage you to talk with your school districts, or just, give BRS a call and ask about that as well.
Thank you. Yep, go ahead, Julie.
I was going to say a word about that. I think, obviously we want agency collaboration. What I've also seen too many times is that districts put the onus and the responsibility on BRS. And sometimes don't take the responsibility for themselves as well. And it really should be an equal partnership. And I've had lots of students who are supposed to have opportunities through BRS. They don't fall through, so they do nothing over the summer, and then the district doesn't pick up. So just be aware that it's not just BRS who's responsible, that's a collaborative effort. And you have to be very clear about who's doing what and who's responsible for what. Because BRS, those can't be IEP goals, right?
Thank you.
So that's all.
Okay.
There also are one little.
Of course, go ahead.
There are some because I want it to be positive too in relationship to what's available. There are some wonderful. There's like a Cafe Joyeux, which is very specific to individuals with intellectual disabilities. Invictus Bakery in Brooklyn, and I believe Staten Island now. There's a movie theater, and I'm drawing a blank on the name in Connecticut.
Oh, the Prospect.
Yes.
Prospect Theater. Thank you. Prospect
yeah.
Theater, which has been around for a really long time.
There's Coffee for Good in Greenwich.
Coffee for Good is wonderful, right? Yep, absolutely. I was getting to them too.
Eames and
Yes.
Company.
What was that one, Melissa? I'm sorry.
Eames and Company in Avon, Connecticut.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that one. Love Michael is another one. There's a bunch of different organizations out there, non-for-profits, that are working towards providing these essential job placement opportunities, and do the training and lead to sustainable employment. So there are some really cool opportunities out there based on each individual's needs, especially for individuals where college is not the pathway for them.
So we are just about at the end of our hour. I do have one more question I'm going to direct to Melissa. And while I'm doing that, I want the rest of you to think if there's any other piece of advice that you would give for families that are beginning this process. Melissa, the question I want to ask you is, you've got a background on the education side as well as administration. And what would you want administrators and school personnel to understand about transition planning?
I mean, I want them to understand that it really has to be individual. Like they have to individualize, because I see school districts now school districts are attempting to create their own in-district transition programs. And I think that's great, because I think for some students, those programs will be great. But what's happening, unfortunately, is, okay, we have a transition program. So when you're ready for transition, this is your program, regardless of whether it's appropriate or not for that individual child. So I think that it's just so critical to individualize transition, just like you would any other part of the IEP journey for a student. And I'm going to say it again, the mapping, the futures mapping planning is a great way, is a great foundation for that. And I think I've actually been invited, even as the attorney, to some of these where the school principal, the school administrator, and the actual special education director attended. I mean, that's optimal in my opinion, because that is really with community members and that is really wraparound at its finest. But I applaud the efforts that districts are putting forth to try to create transition programs within the community, within the school district. And again, for some students in the district, that's going to be wonderful, but it's not going to be appropriate for all students. And just the importance of individualizing is just critical. And just and just not not assume that that parents are going to be the ones, forcing their hand on this. Like I'd really love to see administrators be much more proactive. Even though the law in Connecticut is that transition is supposed to start at 14, I can't tell you how many clients I get that are 15, 16, and 17 where the word transition has never come up at one of their PPT meetings. Yeah. And so yeah, I'd like them to be compliant first and foremost, but I would just also like them really to remember the importance of individualizing. Just because you have a transition program, which might be very good and very sound in your district, it's not going to be appropriate for every child in your district that requires transition services.
All right, thank you. So I'm just going to go in the order I see you on my screen for your last bit of advice. John, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I think, however you view your child's next steps, time and having that longer runway is incredibly valuable. So try not to think about it as a loss of time. It's not. It actually prepares and provides so much support and structure. I think probably all of us at some point in time could have used more time, right? So I really always implore families to not think about this as a negative, just because you might think that your child and feel very strongly that your child needs more time, and help encourage them that this is not a step backwards. It's a step forward, a big step forward.
Thank you. Ashley?
Sure. I would suggest really looking at your child's transition goals. So you should really be working closely with the counselors, any transition coordinator at any transition programs, to make sure that these goals are measurable and that they're addressing the biggest areas of need. I see so many goals that are just not even appropriate at all for what the student wants to do, let alone what they're capable of doing. So I think that these are missed opportunities.
Thank you. Christy?
Yeah, so I would say, as we've been talking about, start soon, start early, but also visit lots of different programs. There's so many different kinds of transition programs out there that are intended to meet the range of, needs that are there. So, and not just as parents, but make sure that you're taking your student with you. They need to be a part of the conversation because they're the one that's ultimately going to have to live it and do it. And so, you can talk with them about what the supports look like in one setting versus versus another setting and the living situation of one versus the other. That's really key, I think.
Thank you. Julie?
Well, these have all been really great answers. And just to piggyback on everything and more of a, I guess, a practical advice is to make sure that you sit down with someone on your team who can explain this process to you, start it as early as possible, and understand what the IEP paperwork says about transition. Go through it item by item, line by line, so that you don't miss a trick. And that I'm not saying that that came out wrong. I didn't mean that the district is trying to trick you. I just, as a coin of phrase, that you don't miss anything, right? Really understand your paperwork and what the obligations are, and work with your school team to understand every step of the way. And again, like everyone has said here, just start as early as possible.
And Melissa, you're going to be last. Somebody just asked a question if there's a list of transition programs, and I feel like I recently saw something about that.
Well, yeah, there is right on the State Department website. There is a list of transition programs.
Thank you.
Right
And now you can answer the question.
on the SDU website. Yeah.
And what would you say is your parting advice?
My parting advice for families is to, I would say, really realistically look at your child. And if you're I know that sometimes parents struggle with the transition pathway, right? And so if your child is like my son was headed in a very functional, transition path versus potentially college bound, that's okay. You want to really make sure you're meeting your child where they're at. Not that you don't want ambitious goals, but you can have ambitious goals no matter where your child is, right? So Ryan had very ambitious goals. He's nonverbal and profoundly autistic, but his goals were very ambitious and appropriate for him. I think sometimes, parents feel like if they do too much on the vocational side and they don't do enough on the academic or, in terms of transition, that they're giving up on their child, they're losing hope. But I think you really just want to meet your child where they're at and understand that, they can progress and live a very meaningful life regardless of, of where they fall.
Thank you. I really want to sincerely thank this panel. The breadth of knowledge has really been enormous, and I've learned a lot. And I can tell from, the questions and the discussion that there's just so much interest in this topic. And as we know, some other topics that we will certainly be addressing in the future. For everyone, the webinar has been recorded and it will be on Facebook and then eventually on our website if you need to rewatch any part of it. Or you missed any part of it. But I would like to thank everyone again for attending and our panel for being here and for everyone who's supporting SELF in our mission. And again, to Chapel Haven for being our sponsor for this webinar. So everyone have a good evening and hopefully we'll see you next month at our school avoidance and refusal webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.